Welcome to Food and Literacy for All, our second class. Glad you all made it here safely tonight and on time. We're getting ready to roll. And so first of all, I'd like to thank our sponsors for this wonderful class. School for Environment and Sustainability, Office of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, Center for Engaged Academic Learning, Center for, I knew I was going to miss this one, Women, Francis and Sidney Lewis Visiting Leaders Fund. Thank you. I'm going to make some announcements. First one is about our local food summit, the week of February 16th. And the keynote speaker is Yvette Perfecto. Thank you. Yeah, so this is the local food summit at the Washtenaw Community College, February 16th, 2019. And the keynote speaker is Yvette Perfecto. We have local food chefs, farm and food workshops, networking, strategic planning, and a lot of good stuff. Hope you'll get a chance to check that one out. This weekend in Traverse City, I think it is, we have the Northern Michigan Small Farms Conference. That is a really amazing conference. My team has gone up there a couple of times. They have awesome workshops, and if you get a chance to participate in that, it would be worth your while. Next week, we have the amazing Sean Sherbin here. He's a sous chef. He's committed to revitalizing Native American cuisine, and so we hope that you'll be here to participate in that and hear all about his amazing work. Free Shadows from Detroit. How many people are here from Detroit? Weather kept us away. Yeah, we need the shadow. So the first shadow is next week from Detroit. And in addition to the free shadows, anyone who wants to carpool with me, I'm happy to do that drive, pick up people. So we want to make sure that people get here and are able to participate. So, without further ado, I bring up my partner, Miss Leslie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for coming tonight. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight, Mónica Ramírez, who just came in on a red-eye from Mexico, via San Diego, via Boston. She almost didn't make it, so we're incredibly thankful that she stuck it out and she still made it to be with us tonight. I can't think of a better way to kick off our speaker series with our first speaker as Mónica Ramírez, especially during the week that we're celebrating the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. Mónica works with farm workers and immigrants as an activist, an author, and civil rights attorney, and she's been doing this work for over 2 decades. She's been fighting for gender equity and against workplace sexual violence experienced by farm workers and immigrant women, and more recently, gaining recognition as part of the Me Too movement. The title of our talk tonight is Seeding Justice, Ensuring Just Conditions for Those Who Feed the World. Farm workers are too often hidden from our view and forgotten. Yet without them, the livelihoods of U.S. farmers, the cost of our food, our dependence on food imports, and the stability and vitality of our rural communities would all be at stake. Approximately 1.5 to 2 million farm workers harvest our food in this country, 45 to 70% of whom are undocumented migrants. They do a job that's so challenging, that's literally backbreaking, that few other Americans are willing to do the job. So before I go on, let me test your knowledge of farm workers. Get out your eye clickers. Make sure when you power them up that you hold down the power button until the little light flashes and then push AA. That should sync it with our machine. So the question is, what percentage of US fresh fruits and vegetables are handpicked by farm workers? It's showing that almost all of you are here. There's about 15 of you that are absent. We'll figure it out. Pretty good. So D was, let me see if I go to the next slide. So 46% of you chose D, which is the right answer. But still, more than half of you did not know that. About 85% of our fresh fruits and vegetables are picked by farm workers. So if you had breakfast today, if you had lunch, a snack, if you had fresh fruits and vegetables, very likely it was handpicked by farm workers. In Michigan this year, there are nearly 50,000 jobs for farm workers, and we rank 5th in the nation in terms of the registered number of seasonal and migrant farm workers. So they're also really vital to our own agricultural sector here. And I don't know if you remember last fall, but there were stories about apple farmers, producers, and blueberry farmers who were really concerned that they weren't going to be able to make their harvest because they weren't able to secure enough commitments from farm workers. And in part, this is largely in part because of the uncertainty and the fear that has ripped through many of our immigrant communities, with deportation rates increasing in Pontiac and Ypsilanti, Detroit, and other cities in Michigan. So Monica's work is even more vital today than ever in the midst of the longest government shutdown because of a wall our president wants to build along the Mexican border precisely to keep out migrants, many of whom would likely end up working as farm workers. Among other places, Monica has worked with the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement, National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, and the Southern Poverty Law Center. She's co-founder and board president of Alianza Nacional de Campesinas, or the National Farm Workers Women's Alliance. Most recently, in 2014, she founded Justice for Migrant Women, a national advocacy and technical assistance project focused on representing female farm workers and other low-paid immigrant women who are victims of workplace sexual violence. Monica is nationally recognized for her work. You might have seen, if you did your reading, that she recently walked the red carpet a couple of weeks ago as one of the activists that was invited to the Golden Globe Awards. Monica's also our neighbor. She grew up the daughter and granddaughter of migrant farm workers from a rural community in Ohio. She got her law degree from Ohio State University, although we won't hold that against you. And she also has a master's in public administration from Harvard University. So please, let's give Mónica Ramírez a warm Michigan welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here. It was a little concerning at a certain point during the day about whether I was actually going to make it, but I'm really happy to be here. And I want to stop for a second to talk about my introduction, because one of the things that I really appreciate about the introduction is that I speak all over the country and even in different parts of the world. And usually what people tend to leave out is the fact that I'm the daughter and granddaughter of migrant farm workers. And for me, that's actually the most important thing about my background, because I was privileged enough to go to school. I was privileged enough to become a lawyer and to do the work that I do. But the real honor in being who I am is being the daughter of individuals who literally crisscrossed this country to do the work that is so difficult that was explained. And in fact, my mother and my great-grandparents who raised her used to pick cherries here in Michigan. So thank you for lifting that up, because that really is, for me, the heart of my work. I decided to become an activist and an organizer for the farm worker community sort of by accident. My father used to talk to us a lot about the agricultural community and working as a migrant farm worker and living in some of the camps where my family had lived when we were growing up, myself and my two siblings. And when I was 14 years old, I became an accidental activist, because in my hometown, there was a lot of focus on the fact that fishermen came back to Fremont, where I grew up, but there was no attention given or celebration given to the fact that farm workers returned. And so I became an activist at the age of 14 when I started writing for the local newspaper about migrant farm workers, and I haven't stopped since. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the rights that farm workers have. I'm going to talk to you about some of the rights that farm workers still today don't have. And really, I'm here to talk about how across sectors and industries, and really across movements, we need to be committed to working together to address some of the gaps that still exist for farm workers today. You know, I'm sure that you heard in the introduction that there are wide statistics, sort of ranges, if you will, when we talk about how many farm workers are in the United States, or when we talk about how many of them are undocumented. And that's because it's really difficult to get that data. How many of you can imagine what it must be like for a farm worker who lives on the outskirts of a town here in Michigan to want to, in this climate, talk to someone from a state or a federal agency about themselves, about their work, to even be counted? It's extremely difficult now, just as it's been extremely difficult over the years. And so the numbers that we have related to our community are actually, I would say, probably lower than they should be, because there are so many people who will never be counted for fear. And in the case of women, women often aren't counted because of gender discrimination. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that today. Oops, sorry about that. So many of us who are farm worker organizers or in the farm worker movement have really been able to do our work because we've built our work on the shoulders and on the legacy and on the continued work of Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez with the United Farm Workers. How many of you are familiar with the United Farm Workers? Many of you. And so you know that the United Farm Workers organized in California, where still today farm workers have the most rights because of the work of Dolores and Cesar Chavez and the movement that they created. Many are familiar with the Great Boycott. And in fact, there are people who live in Michigan who were part of the Great Boycott back in the day because the organizers for the United Farm Workers moved all over the country to organize to ask people not to buy grapes when they were trying to fight for improved conditions for farm workers. And so I've had the great fortune over the course of my career, and really over the course of the past 20 years, to know Dolores Huerta, to work with her, and to really build my own work around much of the work that she and Cesar have done over the years, as well as other activists and organizers. And I say that because I'm going to talk to you about my work and what I do and why I do it, but I think that as people who do social justice work, we should never forget who really made it possible for us to do the work that we do. And if it hadn't been for the courageous activism of Dolores Huerta, who still continues to do her work, and of Cesar Chavez, many of us wouldn't have been able to find our voice in the way that we have over the course of the many years that we've been organizing. Oops, I'm doing the clicker backwards. So, you know, farm workers across this country put food on our tables every single day. But farm workers are often not thought of. People often don't realize that there are farm workers who are working in the fields, in nurseries, and in packing sheds across our country. People don't think about the fact that the flowers that we give to people on their birthday, or for Valentine's Day, or for other holidays, were picked by farm workers, cut by farm workers. They don't think about the fact that the nuts that we eat were shelled by farm workers in some cases. So there are many ways in which farm workers touch our lives every day. And over the past decade, as the food justice movement has been really, I would say, booming, there hasn't been much conversation in the food justice movement about what it means to create a justice movement that isn't just for the way that we're growing food and the way that we're ensuring that the food itself is sustainable and it's healthy for us, but what are the just and healthy conditions for the workers? And I think that is actually one of the reasons that I was really intrigued and interested to come here, even though it's Michigan, which we talked about, because there aren't enough people having conversations about sustainable food systems that actually introduce the rights and the circumstances of farm workers. And I actually think that if we don't talk about the circumstances confronting farm workers, who are the people who are bringing foods to our table, then we actually are never going to get to a point where we're creating what is a just and sustainable food system for this country or for any other country. All right, so you have your clickers. How much do you think that a farm worker in the United States today earns on an annual basis? $25,000, $15,000, $30,000, or $20,000 a year? I'm going to give you a minute to answer. I'm really intrigued by this system. 15,000. Sorry, I need help with the system. How do we get the chart back up? I think that's where you had the majority of your answers. It's $15,000 a year. So there's an agricultural worker survey that is conducted by the U.S. Department of Labor. The most recent survey results were published in 2016, and they indicate that the average income for a farm worker in the U.S. is $15,000. But if you were to disaggregate the data by gender, a farm worker woman actually earns about $11,000 a year. There are 700,000 farm worker women in our country. I think that number is off because when those surveys are conducted, often the head of household is the person who completes those surveys. So men are often answering those surveys, and women aren't always being counted when those surveys are being done. So I want you to keep that in mind because when we see data, a lot of times, particularly in the agricultural context, the data isn't being disaggregated by gender. And that's hugely problematic for the work that we do because for the longest time, farm worker women weren't being counted as workers. See, migrant women who are coming into our country for many, many decades were considered to be family migrants. They were thought to be coming to the country to join their husbands. And so it was their role in the minds of many to support their husbands. They weren't thinking of migrant women as economic migrants, and we know that's just not true. Women have always been working in the fields, and they've always been working alongside their husbands, and so their situation is disparate to the situation of men even still today. So when you see that number 15,000, know that it actually is representative of what men are earning on average, but the true average for women is actually lower. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the conditions for farm workers. It's my understanding that some of you in this room are very familiar with the workings on farms because some of you work on farms, or maybe some of you own farms, or maybe some of you are like me and come from farm worker families, or perhaps have even worked in the fields yourselves. I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by each of these before we actually answer them. So when I talk about dangerous working conditions, what comes to mind? What do you think I'm referring to? What are the kinds of dangerous working conditions that a farm worker might be exposed to, or anyone who works on a farm? Machinery. Yeah. Heavy machinery, tractors. Sorry? Heat. Chemicals. What kind of chemicals? Pesticides, exactly. So the answer was pesticides, which is one of the B, pesticides exposure. So there's a range of different chemicals that are used in agriculture to preserve the crops, but there have been a lot of health implications as a result. So pesticides is certainly one that we hear a lot about. What else? What are some of the other dangerous conditions? Sexual harassment.
Like lack of breaks.
Lack of breaks. Sir.
Lack of proper medical care.
Lack of proper medical care. Okay, great. We have a good handle on that one. Pesticides exposure. We talked about that a little bit. Wage theft. What is that? Who can tell me what wage theft is, sir?
It's when
Oh. Go ahead.
it's when an employer refuses to pay for hours worked.
It's when an employer refuses to pay for hours work. In the agricultural context, what it looks like is someone might work an entire day or an entire week and simply not be paid. Sometimes when workers are working in row crops where they pick by the bucket or by the box, their supervisor might change the number that they actually turned in. So sometimes, depending on the crop, if you turn in your bucket or you turn in your basket, you'll be given a chip or a coin, and at the end of the day you turn them in, and that's how many you get credit for. Well, sometimes supervisors might change that number. So say you had 20 coins, they might only give you credit for 10, okay? So wage theft can happen in different ways, and there have been and so yes, that's a great explanation. Discrimination, what kind of discrimination might you consider? What kind of discrimination are you familiar with in the workplace, and what discrimination might you think that farm workers could be exposed to? I'm sorry? Discrimination because of age. Yep. Sexual discrimination. Sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination as well. Someone said that over there earlier. And there are other forms of sex discrimination like pregnancy discrimination, unequal pay, shorting women for hours, giving women different work schedules, or men, depending on the gender of the supervisor who's discriminating. What else? Discrimination based on documentation. So explain that more.
If you're undocumented, you can be expelled or reported at any time. It's extremely difficult to bargain or stand up for your rights in any way.
So the response is that if you're undocumented, you could be expelled at any time, or you might be threatened if you try to assert your rights. Okay? Great responses. So now I'm going to have you answer the question, of these examples, which are some of the circumstances that you think confront farm workers today? All of the above. That's correct. The other one that I want to point out that relates to discrimination is something called retaliation. Retaliation actually isn't only in the context of employment discrimination. It actually can play out for any of these reasons. So if there's someone who is operating a forklift and they get injured on the job and they try to get help by going to the doctor, they could be retaliated against because they might be fired for having gone to get help. If someone becomes sick because of pesticides, same thing. If they try to make a workers' comp claim, if in the state where they're working they're covered, they might be fired or they might end up having their hours shorted. Wage theft. All of these different violations could also be accompanied by retaliation. There are laws in our country that actually prohibit these violations. So in the context of workplace, these dangerous working conditions, there are laws and there are regulations that exist in our country that create standards for workplace safety. And any employer, not just farmers, are required to adhere to certain standards to make sure that workers, when they work, are safe at work. But unfortunately, sometimes accidents happen, and sometimes corners are cut so that the work situation isn't as safe as it should be. Pesticides exposure. For many years, advocates have been trying to improve the conditions for farm workers and the kinds of chemicals that people are exposed to, but not just the kinds of chemicals that people are exposed to, also when people are exposed to chemicals. So I worked on a case in Florida when I represented women who worked in a nursery. They came to me because they were victims of gender discrimination. They'd been sexually harassed. And they told me that one of the things that was happening to them was that they kept getting sick. And they thought it had something to do with the mist that was sprayed on them. About every minute, they were being sprayed with the mist. And in that mist was a chemical to try to help preserve the plants. But it was being sprayed on them as they worked. And so they were getting rashes and headaches, and they were becoming very ill. And so in the course of that case, I filed different kinds of complaints on their behalf. Right? I helped them with the sexual harassment that they experienced. I helped them with the retaliation that they experienced for complaining in the first place. And it turns out that after the investigations were done, they were in fact being sprayed with chemicals. But in addition to those chemicals that were dripping on them throughout the workday, when the investigator from the Department of Labor went out to investigate the situation, they witnessed an applicator, the pesticides applicator, the person whose job it is to spray the plants to make sure that they don't get eaten up by bugs. The investigator actually witnessed the applicator spraying people. So they didn't tell the people to get out of the area before they sprayed. And there are regulations and there are laws that provide standards so that things like that don't happen. In that case, actually, another thing that we found out after the complaints were filed was that every single woman who worked at that nursery and every single department was paid at least $1 an hour less than their male counterpart for doing exactly the same job. I lift that up as an example because it is very possible that the same worker might be experiencing multiple different kinds of violations against them in the same job. So that might be all of these, or it might be some of these. And this is just a sampling of the kinds of conditions that some workers across the country are still experiencing. All right, so we've talked about sexual harassment a bit. I want to talk a little bit more about that because maybe not everyone in the room is clear about what we're talking about, and I want to make sure that we're all really clear because that is a major issue that farm worker women particularly experience. So, first of all, can someone please tell me, when I say sexual harassment, what do you understand that to be? And you don't have a microphone, so you'll have to speak really loudly. What's sexual harassment? Did you raise your hand back there? No. Don't be shy. I'll answer. I know the answer. There's a legal definition of sexual harassment, right? The legal definition of sexual harassment under our federal anti-discrimination law is any unwanted sexual attention that can range in unwanted sexual comments, touching, and it can escalate to attempted sexual assault or rape, attempted or completed sexual assault or rape. And there are other things that are included in sexual harassment as well. The federal law that prohibits sexual harassment, it actually prohibits discrimination, sex discrimination being the broad category, sexual harassment being the more specific category under that group of unlawful activity. That law is a federal law, but in states across the country, there are also state anti-discrimination laws. So the federal law is called Title VII. And my question to you is, are all workers protected by the federal anti-sexual harassment law that exists in our country today? You get to use your clickers again. Right. So 56% of you said no. So for those of you who said no, why? Why do you believe that to be true?
Yeah, undocumented workers aren't really protected by it. Because a lot of times they work in farming communities where they're working for people who are tolerant of people who are undocumented. And usually they know that they're not protected because if they go to the police, they'll probably be figured out that they're undocumented and reported. So they don't want to do that.
Thank you for that answer. So the response is that undocumented people aren't covered, and that in some places where people are living, undocumented people are not welcome there, and people might be afraid to come forward because they're undocumented. And it is true that people might be afraid to come forward if they're sexually harassed, if they're undocumented. And it is certainly true that there are communities in our country that are not welcoming of people who are undocumented. But actually, under the federal law, Title VII, people who are undocumented are covered. Because once they're employed by an employer whose job it is to determine what status people have and whether people are eligible to work, once something happens to the worker, like being sexually harassed, they're covered by the law. But in practice, employers actually use that against workers a lot. And I'll give you an example of a case that I handled. I handled a case on behalf of a woman in North Carolina who was sexually harassed for a number of years and tried to get help. And every time she tried to get help, she started being treated badly by the company. And ultimately, the case ended very badly. She was removed from the premises in an ambulance. And in that case, this was actually in a factory, not in agriculture, but it's like cases that I've handled in agriculture where when we actually brought the complaint on her behalf, the company's defense was not that it didn't happen. The company's defense was that she was undocumented and therefore she shouldn't be protected. And the federal government responded by saying she is in fact protected no matter what her status is, and if you continue to say that she's not protected or shouldn't be helped, then we're going to consider that a form of retaliation and take additional action. So I appreciate your response because it's really complicated, but there's a both and there. Yeah. All right. Why, for those of you who said no, why do you think that not every worker in this country is protected by federal anti-sexual harassment law? Any other guesses? Oh, sorry, I didn't see. Go ahead.
I think the assumption, at least when I was answering this question, was that are they protected in practice or are they protected legally? I think legally they are, but in practice no. That's why I said no.
That's a great response, and I think that both are in part it's true. Under the law, you have to work in a place that has 15 workers or more to be covered. So if you are working even right now in a place that has fewer than 15 workers, like a restaurant or in some other location, under our federal law, if you were to be discriminated against, and specifically if you were to be sexually harassed, you wouldn't be covered by the federal law. You wouldn't be able to bring what is called a charge of discrimination because the law requires 15 workers or more. There's also other issues that create barriers for people to come forward if they've been sexually harassed, like a time limitation. So you only have a certain amount of time under the federal law in order to bring a complaint for sexual harassment or other forms of discrimination. So in my work, particularly post Me Too, we have been fighting really hard to change the law so that all workers, no matter where you work, if there's even one person employed, you should be covered by the federal law. That has to change, and we're advocating to change that. But I want to address the other point that you made, because I think it's a really important one, in that in practice, not everyone is actually covered. So if you work in a place that's covered by federal law, 15 workers or more, it might be difficult for you to access the law. And when it comes to farm workers, particularly those who migrate, it's extraordinarily difficult to access the law, right? Because many migrant farm workers specifically are traveling from place to place, town to town. I've talked to workers who've told me that they don't even actually know where they are because they didn't grow up, when they were living in Mexico, dreaming of living in a little town outside of Iowa, right? Like they don't have a place, their placement on the map for where they even are, let alone what their rights are, what the legal system is. So in that way, the law, even if they are covered by the threshold that exists under federal law, the law might not be accessible. The other thing is that in practice, some people aren't able to actually bring their cases or move their cases forward because they can't find a lawyer. Perhaps they can't find someone who would be willing to help them through the administrative phase, which is a phase that's required before you actually bring a lawsuit. Maybe there isn't an interpreter who can help them if they don't speak English. Maybe they're afraid because they're undocumented. So there are many very practical reasons that even people who are covered by the threshold that set out in the law, they actually can't receive protection. So thank you, because I think that is the case for many people. We are seeing the numbers shift in terms of people who bring those kinds of complaints, in particular because of the awareness that's been brought post Me Too, because of the amazing work of Toronto Burke.
What is the justification for that 15-person threshold?
That's a great question. The question is, what was the justification that was made by creating the 15-worker threshold? So back in the 1960s, when the law was first passed, there was a real concern that if there were workers who were in smaller workplaces who were covered by the law, that small farmers would go out of business. So they were trying to protect small business owners, and so they said they should have at least 15 employees or more, because if they have that many, then they might have a general counsel, they might have an attorney, they might have more resources to be able to defend themselves if they had a complaint brought against them. There's also another piece of trivia that I'll share with you, which is that when the law was actually written and before it was enacted, at the 11th hour, there was one category that was actually added in order to try to kill the bill. So of the discrimination, types of discrimination that are covered under federal law, which are discrimination for one's color, discrimination for one's race, right, discrimination for religion, sex, what do you think the category was that was thrown in at the very last minute in an attempt to kill the bill? Sexual orientation wasn't actually covered. Sex generally, sex discrimination, so including sexual harassment and gender and other forms of gender discrimination, that was the broad definition in 1964 when the law became what it is today. There have been modifications over time, so age discrimination was added, pregnancy discrimination was added, but when it was originally passed, the categories were quite broad, and one of the categories generally was sex discrimination. And sex was actually the category that was added at the last minute because people thought that if they added that, the law wouldn't pass. But thankfully it did. All right, what we know in the farm worker context by the studies that have been done, which have been few, is that 90% of the women who work in agriculture in California who were surveyed in the late 80s reported that sexual harassment is a major workplace problem. 9 out of 10 of the women who were surveyed said this. So can you imagine working typically from 5 o'clock in the morning until about 2 when it becomes the hottest part of the day, and then going back to work in the evening in the dusk hours to finish your rows or to do your work in order to make the money that you need to make for that day, and worrying the entire time as you're working around heavy machinery and with sharp knives that you're going to be sexually harassed by a supervisor, by a coworker, by an owner of a company, by a client or a truck driver who might be on the premises. Can you imagine being able to do your work under those circumstances? Well, still today, the numbers that we see across the country haven't changed much for farm worker women. And since the 1980s, and really over the course of the past 30 years, there have not been very many women who've come forward with cases of sexual harassment. When I started my legal practice in 2003, there were about a half dozen women who'd brought cases of sexual harassment. So the law passed in 1964, giving people making discrimination unlawful. Right? And in the 90s, that's really when sexual harassment was defined by a Supreme Court case. It was involving an individual who was working at a bank. The case is called the Meritor Savings Bank case. So we have this lapse in time in which women weren't really coming forward because they didn't know they had rights and they didn't know how to assert their rights. But even after learning about their rights, very few women came forward. And we know that it's because there were a lot of access issues in terms of knowing who could help them, but there also were a lot of other stigmas that were keeping people from coming forward. And so when I started my practice in 2003, there had been very few women across the country who would ever try to access the law. What we know in talking to farm worker women across the country is that because sexual harassment is such a pervasive problem, that they use their clothes to protect them. So they try to cover as much of their bodies as possible in order to try to shield themselves from unwanted sexual attention while they're working. And so included in that is the use of these bandanas that they wear to cover their faces. And so I've talked to women all across the country who tell me that they try to do as much as they can to try to look like a man because they feel like if they do that, then maybe they'll be left alone. And so given this, we made a decision in our work to actually try to use the bandana as a tool for our movement, to do a project where we would bring awareness around sexual harassment using the bandana that people are using that literally is both, it's a shield for them, but also it's a way that they've been quieted. And we feel like we have to do this because we know how difficult it is to talk about sexual harassment. It's taboo. Not just for farm worker women, it's been a taboo in our society for many years to talk about problems like sexual harassment. But the impact of sexual harassment is devastating. And it's not devastating only for the person who experiences it, it's devastating for families. See, what we know about sexual violence based on the statistics that we have in this country is that if someone perpetrates sexual violence, they're likely to perpetrate at an average of 9 times. So in the workplace context, if someone is perpetrating sexual harassment against one worker and that worker never tells because they're afraid, because they might get fired, because they need to feed their families, because they think they're going to get deported, then the perpetrator will continue to perpetrate that violence on other people. And that violence might range from comments and touching to other forms of sexual harassment. And sometimes it escalates, and sometimes it's a one-time incident that's an egregious incident. But the lasting impact of that harm is literally devastating. I represented women who have talked to me about how after they've been sexually harassed, they can no longer have the same kind of relationship with their family members. I represented a woman in Florida who talked to me about how every day she would go home and she would close herself in her room and she would cry, and her little girl didn't know what she'd done wrong. You see, it's a kind of trauma and pain that is very difficult to get over, even when you're getting help. And so we've done our work across this country, myself for over 20 years and others now for 3 decades in our movement, because we know that people, especially the people who literally give us life, give us sustenance, they should not have to go to work every single day and fear that they are going to be sexually harassed and think that they have to put up with it. And we know that their families shouldn't have to suffer this way either. And there should be accountability. And there should be laws that say that even if you're one worker in a workplace, that you should be protected too. And so for many years, we've stood in solidarity, we've marched together, we've spoken out together, we've given each other comfort, we've tried to find healing tools, we've tried to find a way to give voice to this problem so that people don't have to suffer in silence. And even though every single thing you can imagine is up against many of these women, the women in our community are still bravely coming forward. They have everything to lose, but they're still coming forward. And every single woman who I've represented has told me that they are not coming forward for themselves. They're coming forward because they don't want anyone else to suffer as they have. And so here's how some women are taking action. They're taking to the streets to march about it, to elevate the awareness that exists in this country about the fact that there are women who are working in far-off places outside of our communities in states across this country who are experiencing this kind of violence. Women have also brought cases. There's a particular woman who I'm going to talk to you about in a minute, but since I started my practice in 2003, when there were just a handful, there have been many other women across this country, even here in the state of Michigan, who've come forward to try to get justice for the harassment against them. And it's because of them that other women are being empowered. Olivia Tamayo is a hero that we should all know about and we should all talk about. She's the very first farm worker woman in the history of the United States to ever have her case decided by a federal jury. Olivia endured sexual harassment for 6 years. She went to the company to complain, to get help. They called the police, they had the police come, they had the human resources person serve as the interpreter for Olivia. They said there was no problem. Instead of helping Olivia, they assigned Olivia to work in the fields directly across from the house where the perpetrator lived. She was retaliated against. Eventually, Olivia went to a meeting where she was learning about domestic violence. And she stood up in that meeting and she said, if people have rights against being hurt at home, then there must be something that can be done when people are being hurt at work. And as a result of that conversation, she was put in touch with some lawyers, and eventually the federal government represented her, and she brought her case. And still today, Olivia, who's someone I have had the honor and I have the privilege of knowing, talks often about how painful it was for her and how painful the process of coming forward, of bringing the lawsuit, was for her and her family. And even so, she said, that she feels the need to continue to talk about it because she wants other women to be able to see in her that they can come forward if they're experiencing this kind of violence. You see, there's something that happens when people are experiencing sexual harassment and other forms of violence, and that the perpetrators, particularly in this climate, will say, no one believes you. No one will ever believe you. No one will ever help you. No one will ever do anything to help you have more rights or protection. In 2005, I remember when in our country people were marching for immigration reform. In my work, there actually was a spike in harm because the perpetrators were saying to women, no one wants you here. No one wants you here, and no one's going to help you. And so Olivia has said, and other women like Olivia have said, we have to continue to tell our story. We need people to see us so that they can see themselves and so that they can know that they too can come forward if they experience this harm. We believe strongly in our movement and our work that no one, no matter where you work, no matter what you do, no matter how much money a person earns, should experience sexual violence, not any place. And so we've continued to build and build over the years, and actually for a long time our work was never supported. We actually did our work almost completely on a volunteer basis, particularly through Alianza, the National Farmworker Women's Alliance that I helped to co-found, because there wasn't the kind of support that we needed to be able to do our work. But what we knew was that if we didn't do our work, the farmworker women's concerns and priorities would always be put on the back burner. And so I raise that for you because I think it's important for us to understand that each one of us in this room, we have power. We might not always have money. We might not always have important platforms, but we as people have a lot of power. And it's because of the personal power that we each have, and in particular in the work that I've been doing as an organizer with other organizers across this country, we've been able to steadily build a movement. We've had a steady drumbeat over all of these years that has brought us to a place where today, when we had the breakthrough moment in 2017 because of Tarana Burke's work, that we were able to step forward. We were able to step in and talk about the experiences of sexual harassment of farmworker women and what's been done over the years. So not just the problems, but the solutions. And I just want to make sure that you understand that, because every single one of you, I mean, you roll deep in this room. And every single one of you in this room should not discount your personal power, because personal power is what these movements are made of, and personal power is what drives these movements and makes it possible to change the law where they're unjust. So I want to talk to you a minute about consumers' roles. See, not everybody in the country is out there organizing in the same way I'm organizing. But do you think that everyone in this country, or everyone around the globe who's a consumer, has a role in addressing some of the justice issues that pertain to farm workers? Where's your clickers? Yes, no, or I'm not sure. Yes? No? Okay. So the overwhelming majority of you say yes. For those of you who said no, do you feel comfortable sharing why you think maybe consumers don't have a role in addressing some of the justice issues? Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's an excellent point in that, sometimes as consumers, people are encouraged to buy certain products because they're told that, these were made under just conditions, they were grown under just conditions, or perhaps without chemicals, or they're organic, or what have you. But sometimes they're out of reach for folks because they're too expensive. Farm workers who put food on our table, they can't afford to often eat either, right? I talked to some of my friends who worked in the fields, bless you, for many years, and they talked to me about the fact that there are certain vegetables that they actually don't eat anymore because their family cooked with that one particular vegetable all the time because that's what they picked and the farmer would let them take them home. And so I have a friend who has a real strong reaction against eggplant. She can't eat eggplant because she picked eggplant for so many years. This is real, right? There are people who are picking the food who can't afford the food, but there are also people who want to do the right thing who can't afford that. And so what are some of the solutions to address cost? Maybe you're going to get to that in a different class. But do you have any ideas? So some ideas that I've come across have been food co-ops. But I also think that it's important for us to remember that it isn't just buying food that we know is produced under just conditions that is a way that we as consumers can engage. What are some other ways that as consumers we can support workers so that they also have just conditions?
We can look at our representatives, and if you have the right to vote in this country, you can vote for people who support policies and practices that will protect these people.
Great. So the answer was that if you can vote, then we should be considering who our elected representatives are and whether they're supporting the kinds of policies that impact farm workers.
On a level even before that, you can be someone who's looking to talk to your local legislation or see legislation about it, like open dialogue about it.
Great. So open dialogue with elected representatives about these issues. What else?
Through your pocketbook. Like you were saying before about the Great Boycott. I can remember that as a child. That was a big thing. And so you can pay attention to the growers who are using the practices that you're looking for and favor their products over the producers that are not.
Great. So the power of the pocketbook. Supporting the growers who are doing the right thing by workers and not purchasing items from those who aren't. What else?
Farmers markets and speaking with the people who you are buying the food from and who are also growing the food.
Great. So purchasing your produce from farmers markets and talking with the people who are selling the food and who are growing the food. Okay. Did you have something?
The question I have is, how do you find out which growers are? It's very difficult. I want to support the workers, but it's hard for me, and it gets all like shuffled then.
Yeah. So the question is, how do we know who to support? How do we know which are the growers that are doing the right thing by their workers? So I wanted to lift up the work of the United Farmworkers, which I talked about before, which continues to organize with workers. Last week, they just supported workers in a boycott against a company, the Halo Citrus Company, because they were going to roll back wages without any warning to workers. And so the workers organized, they boycotted, and I think it literally was from a Friday to a Sunday, they were able to negotiate, and the company put the wages back to what they were supposed to be at. They weren't supposed to have rolled them back in the way that they did. So that organizing is continuing. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers, I'm sure many of you are familiar. I think they're organizing it on a lot of campuses. That's another organization. There's an organization in Oregon called Pekun. So there are a number of different organizations across our country that are organizing with workers to improve conditions. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers has a corporate social responsibility program, but it's actually worker-driven, which is a different model than some people use. Oxfam has a program where they're working to create solutions with growers, and they're asking them to sign on to be part of this agreement, basically saying that they're going to uphold the rights of workers. I lift up these examples because if you were to go to the United Farmworkers website, or if you were to go to the Coalition of Immokalee's website or some of these other groups, you would see that they're talking about their campaigns, their active campaigns. But the UFW has, back in the day, they created a special label that had the flag on it. And so those of you who are familiar with the grape boycott might remember this. There was a special label that was created that would designate which grapes were grown under just conditions. Well, now they have a list that they keep on their website that includes the names of all the different growers that they have union contracts with. So I'm happy to provide, for those of you who are interested in more of those kinds of lists and those kinds of sort of that kind of guidance for consumers, I'm happy to share that information with you. I can send you an email or I can provide it to Lily so that she can share it with you. That is a very effective way of knowing what's happening on the ground, because I agree with you. It's really hard to keep track. Unless you're in the work every day, it's really hard to keep track. I would also say keep an eye on what's happening locally. Right? There are several great organizations here in Michigan that are organizing with farm workers. And so I'd keep an eye on who's doing the work here in the state and what kinds of cases they're working on and who's involved. But the other thing I want to mention to you is that farm workers in our country are not allowed to be members of unions outside of California. So when Cesar and Dolores were organizing, they were able to get a law passed, the California Labor Relations Act in California, and that is why the union exists in California. But under what is called the National Labor Relations Act here in the US, farm workers were specifically excluded from that law. So farm workers across our country are part of membership organizations like CIW, but they're not part of unions. And unions are really important because unions organize and advocate and negotiate for the collective good of the workers. So I want to mention that to you because you might wonder why people aren't part of unions or maybe why they don't have contracts. That goes back to what our friend in the back was talking about and what we're saying up here about our political representatives, because there's no reason why farm workers still today should be excluded from some of the protections that exist for other workers, including the right to organize. We have a lot of work to do. We have been working across sectors and movements for many, many years, and there's still a lot of work to do because 80 years later, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the law that creates the protections for all workers, so the minimum wage is under the Fair Labor Standards Act, the right to earn overtime is under the Fair Labor Standards Act. For 80 years, farm workers have been excluded from protections offered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. Still today, farm workers are not entitled to overtime. So even if they work 60 hours in a week, under our federal law, they're not entitled to overtime. So we have a lot of work to do, and we can't do it on our own. Because every single problem that I've talked to you about today, whether it be wage theft or sexual harassment or other forms of discrimination, these are all huge problems. And sometimes they exist all together, all at once. So you can imagine how overwhelming it is for the person, but even as an organizer, it can be overwhelming. And so that is my goal in being here today, because I want you to understand the scope of the situation for workers. But I also want you to understand that you all have a role in addressing these situations, whether it's going to be through your profession, whatever that might be. Some of you in this room might be social workers, or maybe you're teachers, or maybe you're going to be economists. Whatever job it is that you're going to do after you leave this school, farm workers need whatever service you can offer. We need support from people who are conscious consumers. We need people who are going to go and talk to political leaders about farm workers who they think are powerless and voiceless. Farm workers are not powerless. And farm workers are not voiceless. Farm workers simply have not been given the same platform as everyone else in this country. And so to the extent that they don't have the access or the platform, we need you to help us get the message out. And the last thing that I will say to you is that it is going to be a hard battle for us over the next year because we're still talking about the fact that there are political leaders in this nation who want to build a wall and who are caging our children. There are people who are coming from Central America who are fleeing rural communities, who are our people and need our help. So the situation isn't the situation that we've seen over the past 30 years exactly the way it's always been. The situation is acute. And we have to talk about the fact that when there are people talking about building walls and caging our children, the people who are working in the fields of our country are not safe. And they will not be safe until we change the climate that exists towards them, towards migrants, towards immigrants, and towards workers. And that is the work that we must do together. All work must be safe work, and all of us play an extremely important role in ensuring that every single person in this country is treated with dignity, love, and respect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. We have about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A, so I'll pass this mic to Leslie.
I got a mic. Okay. Now it's your turn. Questions?
There's one over there.
We have runners up. Okay.
What's your name? Hold on.
Would you stand up, say your name, and what's your involvement in the food systems?
We're recording this, so we want the question and answer session to still be part of the recording.
Okay. Hi, my name is Courtney. I'm an artist that makes work about edible insects and ethically producing that. What is that? Like how they're going to be sold in the United States and throughout the world. I'm wondering how you define a farm worker, and then if that definition is different legally.
So there are different legal definitions for farm workers. So there's a definition for what a farm worker is under the Agricultural Labor Protections Act. And there are different kinds of farm workers. So there are farm workers who migrate, there are farm workers who are seasonal, and there are guest workers who are farm workers. So let me tell you what each of those are. And my personal definition of what a farm worker is actually hews pretty closely to what the federal definitions are. So a migrant farm worker in our country is someone who migrates from place to pick produce. And when they define produce, it's as expansive as bee pollen, right? So there's, it's fruits, vegetables, plants, seeds, nuts, and there are a whole range of other products that are considered to be agricultural in nature. Seasonal workers are workers who live in a place year-round and then work in those crops by the season. So for many years, my family worked as seasonal workers, and they would live in our town, and then they would, in the summer, they'd pick cucumbers or they'd pick tomatoes. Those are called seasonal farm workers. And then a much smaller percentage, although it's now a growing percentage in our country, are agricultural guest workers. Guest workers are individuals that come to the United States with a special visa. The visa often, it's by law, can't be more than 11 months out of the year the person is here working legally with that visa, and they work in agriculture. Only about 1% of people who come on guest worker visas are women. The overwhelming majority are men, and there are certain rights that people have when they come with those visas, like they have a right to certain kind of housing, they have a right to a certain amount of work under their paid contract. So those are all different kinds of farm workers by the federal definitions that exist in our country. And for me, anyone who's working in a nursery, in a packing shed, or in the fields is a farm worker. One of the things that's changing, and I've heard has pretty recently shifted, is that now the federal definition is going to include urban migrants. So for a long time in our country, when people referred to migrants, they were only talking about people who were working in agriculture as migrant workers. But post-Hurricane Katrina, the definition of migrant worker really changed, because migrant workers started to include people who are migrating to do cleanup work and who are migrating for other kinds of work. And so now there's been a discussion about including urban migrants sort of under some of these definitions and under some of these programs. But for purposes of my work and the work that I've done with farm workers over the years, it's really been specifically with those who are working in the fields, those who are working in packing sheds, and those who are working in nurseries. I have also done work with people who are working in meat packing and in poultry. Yeah.
Right here.
Hi.
Hi.
I am a farm manager in the area. I work with a couple other people with a team that manages a farm. It's a very small farm, and it has a history of being incredibly environmentally conscious, so we make a lot of decisions. We don't use any pesticides, any herbicides, all of that stuff. And I'm grateful for those practices, but something you just said a minute ago really struck me about, or no, it was based on a question or a comment, but that, you know, the prices of our food are high, and because I'm making the budget every year, I understand why we can't, you know, we're a really small farm, we're choosing to employ these practices that are challenging and make for a lot more work and a lot more labor. And I appreciate that work, but I can't help but feel like we're contributing to like a widening of an economic gap and a food accessibility gap, because I'm so very aware that a lot of people cannot afford our food and therefore buy other food that I know are produced by workers that are not being treated fairly.
Right.
And so I have like this very mixed moral thing happening inside of me about that. And I guess I feel that we're not really at the moment contributing to a true cultural shift, that we're promoting a sort of widening of a gap of accessibility. And I guess I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how, you know, we could do our work to be a little bit more conscious of this kind of other side of the game that we're not a part of in the same way.
Thank you for that, because one of the things I was reflecting on as I was standing up here is something I wanted to say is that as a farm worker organizer and as someone who comes from the worker side, I think that there's a misconception that farmers and farm workers are at odds. I actually think that in our country, the way that things have happened economically, there are many farmers in our country who can't make it either. And I think that when we talk about coalition building, I think that we have to be really strategic and creative about how we're going to build coalitions with farmers to try to push for better protections and even subsidies. Because it shouldn't be that it feels like the weight of the world is on the farmers, and particularly those who are trying to do the right thing, who are trying to implement best practices, but then essentially get priced out because they're not a factory farm or because their products are more expensive. I think that that is actually where we have to think about where the government comes in to try to make things more affordable across the board, because we shouldn't have to trade on eating good food for also having good practices, right? Those should actually be a combined effort. And so I think that we have to start building, as an activist and organizer, we have to start building more coalitions that actually include farmers, so that when we go to the negotiating table, which we will this Congress, right? There was just a new bill that was introduced last week that will impact the rights of farm workers, we should actually be going in together. Because I think what's happened is that political leaders who I've met with, over the years talk about how they need to hear from the farmers and then they need to hear from the farm workers. And then somehow the decisions are made. And if you're a small farmer, your ability to lobby is much different than a factory farm's ability to lobby, right? Or a corporate farm's ability to lobby. And so I think that for me, part of the solution is figuring out how we bring boutique farmers, smaller farmers together with farm workers, where I think there is a lot of alignment for us to sort of build these strong coalitions to go in and advocate across the board. Because I actually think that I think legislatively is sort of the way that we're going to get to that solution faster. But the other thing that I've heard about, which I think is really interesting, is, I'm not sure if you all have heard about this, but there are some new stores that have started to open in different parts of the country where there are food deserts, where, because not all produce can actually go to market. It has to be like perfect produce, right? It can't be scarred, it can't be harmed. And so there's tons of produce that never actually makes it to the store. And so there was somebody, I think the person used to work for a major store and realized that this was a problem. So they started putting these stores in these areas where there are food deserts. Do you know about this? You ever heard of it? Yeah, exactly, that guy, or that person. So I don't know if it was a guy or woman. I don't want to make I don't want to make any assumptions here. And so they started putting these stores in these areas where there are food deserts so that the imperfect produce could be in the stores and people could pay what they could afford for them. So the produce and the good food are still getting to people, but it's sort of like it's the in-between, right? Like we have people who literally live in places where they don't have any good food, but there's good food that can't make it to market because it has a blemish. So I sort of feel like it's like both, right? We need to find solutions so that the food can get to market and be accessible to people without being outrageously expensive. But I think that there has to be a legislative solution where there are more subsidies to be able to make good food, and I think that needs to be coupled with the demands that we're making for better rights for workers.
Right here. And then there.
Hi, I'm Amber. I'm a recent grad, and I'm still trying to figure out what way I want to impact food systems. But my question was about some of the labor standards. My dad negotiates for construction unions, so I was really shocked to find that farm workers weren't involved in any of those sort of national coverages. I was wondering if you could rename those certain laws that you mentioned and speak to if there are any movements to sort of change them and include farm workers.
Yeah, thank you. So one that I need, the one of the major laws that farm workers have been excluded under is this law called the Fair Labor Standards Act. Right, that's the law that provides the minimum wage, the overtime, and some other worker standards. So for 80 years, since that law was first passed, farm workers have not been included under that law, specifically with respect to overtime. So there have been some gains made on some of the other provisions. So farm workers are entitled to minimum wage, but they're not entitled to overtime, and there's some other exceptions that exist. So last year, on the anniversary of the passage of that law, the 80th anniversary of that law, the United Farm Workers, Farm Worker Justice, and a couple of other advocacy groups worked together to try to advocate on behalf of farm workers to get a law introduced. And so Senator Kamala Harris and Representative Raul Grijalva, introduced bills in the House and the Senate to finally include farm workers for the first time under our federal overtime laws. That didn't make it through last session, and so it'll be reintroduced, I'm sure, in the 116th Congress. And we, the organization that I co-founded, Alianza, we helped doing advocacy and education around that law. So that will be another opportunity in this Congress to try to push for them to be included. For us, it's really important for the political leaders to hear the stories of people about why they need to be included and how not having overtime impacts them. And so we'll continue to bring the stories forward. And one thing that you could help do is to help amplify those stories, because we'll put them out on social media in other ways. Last year we made some videos where farm worker women were talking about why the overtime law is so important to them. So that would be something to consider. The other law that specifically prevents farm workers from being able to form a union is the National Labor Relations Act. That is the law that provides for workers to be part of unions, and farm workers and domestic workers were specifically excluded from the National Labor Relations Act. And so we need workers to be able to organize, and if they're not going to be permitted to be part of unions, then they need to be able to form other organizing structures so that they can be able to fight in a collective manner for their rights. So there's going to be more work around that. And then the other thing that we'll be continuing to work on is sort of the role of corporate social responsibility programs and worker-led social responsibility programs to sort of hold employers accountable to the rights of workers.
Okay, you have a question?
Hi, my name is Sonia, and I am studying converting food waste and other solid waste into energy. And I'm curious what your view of the role of standardizing labels so that consumers in grocery stores can choose to purchase products more easily that support labor protections for farm workers. And after you address your role, side note or further thought would be how, if that is important, how do we as consumers push towards more standardization of labels?
Yeah, I am in favor of it. There's an initiative that I talked about briefly that Oxfam created, which is the Equitable Food Initiative. So the Coalition of Immokalee Workers has one initiative, and then Oxfam has another. They both are pushing for standardization of various different sort of work norms, but both of them have talked about coming up with labels so that consumers would know. Not just, there's been a lot of talk about labeling, so that now we see more things that say that it's gluten-free and it's vegan or nut-free or what have you, but they want to include some kind of indication that it's a good workplace, basically. So there's been discussion about that. I'm not exactly sure in practice what it looks like because I haven't been at the table when they've been having those conversations, but I think that would be helpful and would address the question that you raised. It's just like, how do you know who to buy from? I also thought that, I don't remember who it was back in the middle area here who talked about sort of the importance of having a relationship with the local farmers and farmers markets. I think that is really, really important because you can then have a conversation with the people who are in your community, who care about the people who are working in your community, about what the environment is like for the workers, what kinds of things they're doing to make sure that the workplace is safe for the workers. I think that it's really important to think locally and to try to engage people at the human level in terms of conditions. So I think labels would help, certainly, but I think it's going to be a little while for that to happen because that will have to happen legislatively. It could happen at the state level. There could be a bill passed here in Michigan, for example, that would address labels, but at the federal level it would have to happen, either the USDA would have to implement something through regulations, or Congress would have to do it through a law, by passing a law, and that could take a little longer. But I think one of the faster ways to get to what you're talking about is the relationships with local growers.
Is there another one?
Maybe I can ask the last question. Could you speak a little bit more about how the Me Too movement has impacted your work?
Yeah, so are you familiar with Time's Up? Do you know what that is? Time's Up. So I wrote the letter that sparked the creation of Time's Up. Alianza, our members were really concerned about the treatment of women in entertainment because we understood what they were going through, and so we made the decision to make a public statement about what they were experiencing. And we actually never intended to publish it as a letter in Time magazine where it was published and then went viral. We actually intended to read it at a march, the Take Back the Workplace march. But I was in touch with Time magazine around the time that the letter was published because they asked me if any of my clients wanted to be involved in a story that is now known as the Silence Breaker story. So one of the women who's affiliated with our organization is a silence breaker who was on the cover of Time magazine. And so it was around that time that we were in communication about that. I told them that we were going to be reading this statement at a march. They ended up publishing it in Time magazine. Some women in the entertainment industry read it, and that then motivated them to create what is now the Time's Up movement. So I've been very involved in Me Too and Time's Up, and have been, had the great honor of working very closely with Tarana Burke over the past year to build out the vision of what it is to address sexual violence across the spectrum, not just in the workplace, because Time's Up is very, very focused on gender equity and violence in the workplace, and Me Too is focused on the spectrum of sexual violence. And so over the past year, I did go to the Golden Globes, as was mentioned, with Laura Dern, but over the past year, we've really been trying to think about how we can push at all levels to try to address these really difficult problems. And so around the anniversary of the Me Too breakthrough, a group of us published a letter in New York Times, which is called We Seek a Better World. And we laid out very clearly a challenge to different people. So we challenged philanthropy to raise at least $23 million to start to seed a fund. So for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with what Time's Up ended up doing, was that when the decision was made to create Time's Up, there was a decision specifically to create the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, which is a fund to help people who've been victims of sexual harassment. And within about 2 months, the fund generated about $22 million. And since it was launched last January, there have been about 3,000 individuals across the country who've received help through the fund, and there have been 700 attorneys across the nation who are pro bono attorneys now for that fund. And so when we issued the challenge and Seek a Better World, we challenged philanthropy in the United States to match the funds that have been raised by the Time's Up movement. We have challenged states across the country to pass 20 laws, so 20 by 2020. So we've asked for the state, we're challenging states across the country to pass stronger anti-sexual violence laws by 2020, and so we'll be actively advocating around that. We have challenged the federal government to pass a broader anti-sexual harassment law so that all workers in all workplaces will be protected and covered, including people who are working in the gig economy. So people who are, driving cars or who are dropping off food who currently wouldn't be covered, we've asked them to expand the definition. And we've actually also challenged world leaders to meet us in building something across the world that would be like an answer to the Me Too revelations. Because what we know is that after Me Too, the Me Too moment happened in October of 2017, it wasn't just people here in the United States who were speaking out about violence, it was people all over the globe. And so over the past year, we've seen countries across the world respond, and I gave the keynote address last year at the United Nations on International Women's Day and had the opportunity to challenge our world leaders to really do something about these problems. So I've been really involved, really busy.
Yeah.
And have a lot of heart, and things are changing. There are laws that have been introduced all across the country. There are companies that are changing their practices. And I think most importantly, people feel like they can talk about something that many people felt like they couldn't talk about before.
Well, on that note, I want us to all give you a round of applause and thank you again for sharing your amazing work. Really appreciate it.
And so we have to end with the Si Se Puede. So in our movement, the farm worker movement, we do a unity clap, and we also do a Si Se Puede. So I'm going to ask you to stand up. And I'm going to teach you how to correctly do a unity clap, which is we're going to start clapping slowly, and then we're going to get faster, faster, faster. But we're not going to then just stop, which is what people do. We're going to sort of then bring it down quietly, and we're going to end together, okay? And then after that, we're going to do 3 Si Se Puedes. So we're going to do clap together, and then we're going to say Si Se Puede, Si Se Puede, Si Se Puede. Do you want to practice the Si Se Puedes before we get into it? All right. And we're going to actually, I'm going to integrate it into the chant at some point. All right. Do you all ready? Want to say Si Se Puede? Yeah. Are you good? Okay. Si se puede, si se puede, si se puede. You got it. Okay, here we go. Here's the unity clap. Si se puede, si se puede, si se puede, si se puede.